Hello, and welcome back to Restful Nightmares, where we weave tales that linger in your thoughts long after the last word. Tonight, we have something different. A story that will make you question every shadow, every flicker of movement, and most of all, whether you're ever truly alone. But before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you curled up in bed, or maybe just winding down from a long day? Let me know in the comments. And if you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to subscribe. There's much more to come. Now let's dive into tonight's tale. It was a quiet evening in early autumn. The kind of night where the air was crisp but not too cold. Just enough to remind you that the seasons were shifting. Lily had just finished her day's work at the small coffee shop she ran in the heart of town. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving behind the soft glow of streetlights, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. She had always found comfort in the routine of it all, the predictable rhythm of her daily life, opening the shop, serving regulars, and closing the door behind her at the end of the night, had always been her safe space. The world felt contained within those walls. Tonight, like most nights, Lily made her way back to her apartment. It wasn't far, just a short walk down the block. Her place was modest, tucked on the second floor of an old building that had seen better days. She had lived there for a few years now, and in that time it had become her sanctuary. She loved the soft creak of the wooden floors, the faint smell of old books that lingered in the air, and the view of the park across the street was peaceful, serene even. Lily locked the door behind her, slipping off her shoes and placing her keys on the small table by the door. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound that filled the apartment as she made her way to the kitchen to prepare dinner. As she moved about, something felt off. It wasn't anything she could put her finger on, but a slight unease had settled over her. She tried to ignore it. After all, it had been a long day and perhaps she was just tired, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It started with a subtle shift in the air. The temperature seemed to drop in one corner of the room, near the window. A draft, maybe? She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the curtains fluttering, but they remained still. Still, the cold persisted, wrapping itself around her like an invisible hand. She brushed it off and returned to chopping vegetables, but the feeling didn't fade. There was something in the silence now, something that felt wrong. A small sound, almost imperceptible, like the faintest scrape of a chair leg on the floor. Lily paused, knife midair, listening intently. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized she hadn't moved anything in the kitchen. She had just been standing there. And it was then that she noticed it. The door to the bedroom was slightly ajar. Just a crack, but enough to make her stomach tighten. She never left it open. Ever. Lily took a hesitant step toward the bedroom, her pulse quickening with each footfall. The apartment was still. The kind of stillness that seemed too perfect, too quiet. She pushed the door open fully, but nothing seemed out of place. The bed was neatly made, the nightstand lamp casting a soft, warm glow. Everything looked normal. Yet, as she turned to leave, her eyes caught something on the floor. A small piece of paper. She hadn't seen it before, and she was sure she hadn't left it there. She knelt down, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. It was a note, written in a hand she didn't recognize. Her breath caught in her throat. She felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Had someone been in her apartment? Had someone left this note as a cruel joke? Now, she was alone, she had been alone when she came home. She would have heard something, right? But now, as the weight of the note pressed into her palm, Lily felt a familiar, suffocating weight of fear settle in her chest. Her eyes flickered toward the window. The streetlights outside were casting long, thin shadows across the room. A shadow in the corner of the room shifted slightly. It usually took a few seconds before the shadow moved again, but it didn't move this time. Lily turned sharply, but the shadow was gone. Her breath quickened and she backed away from the door. There was no way to ignore it now. She wasn't alone. Something, or someone, was watching her. Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The note regime, those 3 words, replayed in her mind over and over again. I see you. She stood frozen for a moment, her hand still gripping the note. The shadows in the apartment seemed to grow darker, thicker, as though they were moving, closing in around her. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears. She forced herself to take a slow breath. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe she had left the door slightly open earlier and the note was just a prank from one of her friends. But as she looked around the room, the doubt crept back in. No one had been in her apartment, she was sure of it. The cold draft near the window still lingered, sending a shiver down her spine. She crossed the room, trying to calm herself, but the silence was unbearable. In the first-class compartment, there was no wall between her and the world, and the shiver had no bounds. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She jumped, startled, and quickly snatched it up. It was a message from her best friend, Mia. "You good? You seemed a little off earlier." Millie hesitated for a moment before typing back, her fingers moving quickly. Yes, a weird feeling. Probably nothing. She stared at the screen for a moment, waiting for a response. When none came, she let out a shaky breath and set the phone down. The kitchen was quiet again, but that unease remained, crawling under her skin. She walked over to the window, her eyes scanning the street below. The lights were dim and the sidewalk was empty, just the usual quiet of the neighborhood. But then, her gaze caught something. A shadow. It was standing in the middle of the street, tall and unmoving. At first she thought it was a person, but it was too still, too unnatural. Her heart stopped for a moment, and she leaned closer to the glass, squinting to get a better look. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It just stood there, as if waiting for something. She put the glass back down and reached toward it with her hands out when she felt something warm. Lily pulled back from the window, her breath shallow. She turned away quickly, her mind racing. Was it someone from the street, or was it something more? She didn't know, but she felt that undeniable sense of being watched. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the sharp sound of the front door creaking open. Lily spun around, her eyes wide, her body frozen in place. She hadn't heard anyone enter. She hadn't heard the door unlock. She stood there, her heart thudding in her chest, straining to hear any movement, any sign that someone was in the apartment. But the only sound was the wind outside, howling softly through the cracks in the walls. Slowly, Lily made her way toward the door, her every step cautious, her breath caught in her throat. She peeked around the corner, expecting to see the door wide open. But it wasn't. It was just barely ajar, the faintest crack between the door frame and the wall. She felt her pulse quicken. Had she forgotten to lock it? Had she left it like this earlier? No. She was sure she had locked it. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the door handle, her mind spinning with possibilities. But when she opened it fully, there was nothing there. If the pyramids were empty, nothing but the quiet of her apartment and the heavy, oppressive silence. Her gaze darted to the hallway. Empty. But as she looked toward the bedroom, her breath caught in her throat once again. The door was open, wide open now, the room dark beyond it. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, suffocating. She could feel it creeping up her spine. Something was there. Lily turned and fled to the bedroom, her pulse hammering in her ears. She could barely see in the dark, but her hand instinctively reached for the lamp on the nightstand. The soft light flickered to life, casting long shadows across the room. Nothing. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Maybe she was just overreacting. Maybe it was the stress of the day. But then, she saw it, the faintest imprint in the sheets, as if someone had been lying there. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. The indentation was still fresh, as if someone had just moved. Her heart raced and her eyes flicked to the window. The blinds were drawn, but she could feel it, the presence, the weight of something unseen, pressing against her. And then, she heard it. A faint rustle from the closet. Lily froze, her breath catching in her throat. The closet door was closed, but she was sure she had heard something. Something moving. Her body trembled as she took a slow step toward it. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to run, to leave, but she couldn't. She couldn't ignore it. The nose. She reached for the closet door, her fingers brushing against the cool wood. With a deep breath, she swung it open. Empty. The closet was empty. But as her eyes scanned the space, her gaze landed on something at the very back of the closet. Something small, hidden in the corner. A pair of eyes. 2 eyes staring at her from the darkness. I screamed. The door slammed shut, and the room fell into silence once more. Lily's scream echoed through the apartment, bouncing off the walls and amplifying the silence that followed. She stood frozen, her body trembling with terror, eyes wide as she stared at the closet door. The air felt thick, like it was pressing in on her from all sides. Her mind raced, her heart thudding in her chest, but the logical part of her, however small it was, tried to make sense of what she had just seen. A pair of eyes in the dark. It couldn't have been real. Lily slowly took a step backward, her feet moving against her will. She couldn't take her eyes off the closet door. It was closed now, but she could still feel the weight of those eyes on her, the unblinking stare, the intense gaze that had locked onto hers. She turned quickly, looking for something, anything, to help her understand what had just happened. Her phone. She needed to call someone to make sure she wasn't losing her mind. But as her hand reached for her phone, the screen lit up, and she saw something that made her blood run cold. A new message. It's from an unknown number. "I'm closer than you think." Lily's breath hitched. She stared at the message for a long moment, her fingers frozen over the screen. Who was this? Who was watching her? The walls of the apartment seemed to close in even further, the air thick with the scent of stale fear. She quickly scanned the room again, her eyes darting to the windows, the hallway, the door. There was no one. No one but her. Yet the feeling that she wasn't alone had never been more real. Suddenly, the sound of a door creaking open echoed through the apartment. Lily spun toward the hallway, her body tensing in fear. The front door. It had to be. But no, the door was still locked, still shut. She hadn't heard the door unlock, she hadn't heard footsteps. And yet, the creaking sound came again, this time louder, as if someone were walking through the apartment. Her pulse raced, her hands shaking as she backed away from the hallway, her mind screaming for her to leave, to run. But she couldn't. Her legs wouldn't move. Then the whisper came. Soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. Lily. The voice was unmistakable. It was hers. But it wasn't her. Lily's breath caught in her throat, her legs giving way beneath her as she sank to the floor. Her heart hammered in her chest as the voice called again, this time closer, more insistent. "Lily, I'm right here." She scrambled backward, her back hitting the cold wall of the bedroom. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing tighter with each breath she took. The darkness in the corners of the room grew, swirling, shifting. And then, just like that, the whisper stopped. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the frantic beating of her heart. Lily looked around, eyes wide, desperate for some sign, some explanation. But there was nothing. The apartment was still. Too still. Then she heard it again. A faint, rhythmic tapping from the other side of the wall. It was slow at first, like someone drumming their fingers, but it grew faster, louder, more insistent. Lily pressed her hands to her ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside her head now, echoing in her skull. Her eyes flicked to the closet. She had to know. Her body moved on its own, trembling with fear as she stood and made her way to the closet door. Every step felt like an eternity. The tapping continued, growing louder, louder. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling, and with a swift motion, she yanked the door open. Nothing. The closet was empty, but the tapping continued, coming from all around her. Lily's mind was spinning, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of the chaos. And then, the shadows in the corner of the closet shifted. Her eyes locked onto it immediately, and her breath caught in her throat. The shadows moved in a way that shouldn't have been possible. like they were alive. The form materialized from the darkness, slowly, almost lazily, as if it had all the time in the world. It was tall, impossibly tall, its shape vaguely human, but wrong. The edges of its form blurred and rippled like a distortion in the air, its features unclear, just a silhouette in the dim light. But those eyes. Lily's stomach turned as she saw them again. Two eyes, glowing faintly, fixed directly on her. And then it spoke. You shouldn't have looked. The voice was soft, a low whisper that sent a shiver through her entire body. It was everywhere, inside her mind, and it filled her ears. Lily couldn't move. She couldn't speak. The fear paralyzed her. The eyes blinked slowly, their glow intensifying. I see you, Lily. The words were sharp, like a knife. The tapping sound continued, now in sync with her heartbeat, louder and louder, until it drowned out everything else. Her body moved before her mind could catch up, stumbling backward, away from the thing in the closet. She collided with the bed, the soft fabric doing nothing to cushion the terror inside her chest. The eyes never left her. They followed her every movement, relentless, unwavering. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps, and her mind raced, searching for an escape. But there was none. Lily. The voice was a low hum now, a constant presence, like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Lily squeezed her eyes shut, but the voice didn't stop. It was inside her head, repeating her name, over and over again. Hey! She couldn't take it, she couldn't breathe. And then, in the distance, she heard something. A faint sound, distant but growing closer. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Real footsteps. She wasn't alone anymore. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Lily's heart raced in her chest as she tried to focus on the sound. Real footsteps. They weren't in her head. They were coming from the hallway, getting nearer, closer, until the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open sent a shiver down her spine. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her body was frozen, her eyes locked onto the shadowy figure in the closet, the glowing eyes staring back at her. It hadn't moved, but its presence filled the room like a weight she couldn't escape. And then a voice broke the silence. Lily, are you okay? Her body jerked, a sudden rush of relief flooding her system as she recognized the voice. It was Ryan, her boyfriend. She hadn't even realized how much she'd been waiting for that voice to reach her. Ryan, she gasped, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and desperation. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes never leaving the closet. Get in here, now. Ryan didn't hesitate. She heard his footsteps moving swiftly toward the bedroom, and a moment later he appeared in the doorway, his face drawn with concern. Finally, he dialed her number. He spoke quickly, his lips trembling. What's going on? What's wrong? He asked, his eyes scanning the room, his gaze lingering on her frantic expression. Lily opened her mouth to speak, to explain the nightmare that had been unfolding, but as she looked back at the closet, her words died in her throat. It was gone. The figure, the eyes, the shadows. Everything was still. Lily? Ryan's voice was soft, his brow furrowing in confusion as he stepped further into the room. What are you? Look at the closet, she screamed, pointing frantically toward the space that had been filled with terror just moments before. But now, there was nothing. No glowing eyes, no shadowy figure. Just a quiet, empty closet. Ryan glanced at her, then at the closet, his eyes narrowing as he took a few steps closer. You're not making any sense. There's nothing there, Lily. Maybe you were just... No, she interrupted, her voice breaking. I saw it. It was right there. The eyes, Ryan. The eyes were watching me. Ryan's face softened, but there was a hint of skepticism in his eyes. He moved to the closet, opened the door wide, and peered inside. There's nothing here. It's just a closet. Lily's breath caught in her throat as she watched him. She wanted to scream at him, to look harder, to see what she had seen. But the more she looked, the more it seemed like she was losing her grip on reality. Was it possible that she had imagined it all? No, she couldn't have. I'm not crazy, she whispered to herself, shaking her head, her fingers trembling. Ryan closed the closet door with a soft click. and turned back to her, his face filled with concern. "Lily, I think you need to calm down. You're freaking yourself out. Maybe it's just stress, or..." But before he could finish, Lily felt it again. The presence, the feeling that someone was watching her. Her heart skipped a beat as she spun toward the window, her eyes darting around the room. The air felt heavier now, thick with something she couldn't name. She opened her mouth to speak, to tell Ryan that something was wrong, but her words caught in her throat when she saw it. The reflection in the window. For a brief moment, she saw a figure standing behind her, tall and dark, its face obscured by shadows. It was the same figure. Her breath hitched and she turned quickly, but when she looked behind her, the room was empty. Ryan was still standing by the closet, his back turned, oblivious to the growing dread that had gripped Lily. Her eyes moved back to the window. There was nothing. It was just the reflection of the empty room. But it didn't feel empty. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. "Lily, what's going on?" Ryan's voice was softer now, his concern growing as he moved toward her. "You're shaking. You need to calm down. Let's sit down and..." "I'm not crazy," she cried out, her voice high-pitched and frantic. "I'm not. There's something in here. There's something watching me," she said. Ryan stepped forward, placing a hand gently on her arm. "Lily, you're scaring me." She flinched, pulling away from him as her eyes scanned the room. It felt like the walls were closing in, the darkness pressing in on all sides. The weight of it was unbearable, suffocating her, choking the air from her lungs. "I'm telling you, Ryan," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I saw it. The eyes. It's been watching me." Ryan stared at her, his eyes full of confusion, but then his expression shifted. He glanced toward the closet again, and then the window, and, for a split second, his face changed. His eyes narrowed, and there was a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. But then it was gone, and he smiled softly. "Okay, let's just sit down and talk about this. I'm sure it's just..." "No!" Lily cried, her voice cracking with panic. "It's not just in my head. Ryan, listen to me. There's something in this apartment, something wrong." Ryan hesitated for a moment, his brow furrowing, and then he nodded. Okay. Let's check the apartment, together. We'll go through it, room by room. You're not alone in this, all right?" Lily nodded shakily, trying to steady her breathing. The fear in her chest was like a heavy weight, but she knew she couldn't let it consume her. She had to prove it to him. She had to show him that she wasn't imagining this. Ryan moved toward the door, gesturing for her to follow. But as she stepped forward, she caught one last glance at the closet, and for just a moment, she thought she saw the shadow again, moving within the darkness. The apartment felt quieter now, almost too quiet. The sound of her footsteps seemed unnaturally loud as Lily followed Ryan down the hallway. Her mind was still reeling from everything she had seen, felt. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was just waiting for them, hidden in the shadows. Ryan had been reassuring, his voice steady as he led the way. He checked each room with careful precision, opening closets, pulling back curtains, scanning every corner with a kind of methodical calm that made Lily's unease grow stronger. It was as if he was pretending everything was fine, but she couldn't do that. Not anymore. She wasn't imagining it. The eyes. The figure. They were real. They had to be. As Ryan moved into the living room, Lily's gaze was drawn once again to the window. The street lights outside cast long, eerie shadows across the room, the faint light filtering through the blinds, leaving streaks of darkness in its wake. Her eyes flicked back to the closet. Still nothing. Ryan stepped back into the hallway, looking at her with a soft, almost patronizing smile. "See? Nothing here. It's just an old apartment, Lily. Things creak. Shadows move. It happens. We're both just tired. We'll get through this." But Lily didn't feel tired. She felt hunted. Her breath quickened as she took a step toward the hallway, her eyes darting nervously to every corner. The weight of the air pressed on her chest like an invisible hand, suffocating her. The longer she stood there, the more the apartment seemed to close in around her. Ryan's voice broke through the fog of her thoughts. "Come on, let's just sit down, we'll talk. Everything's fine." Lily wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. She was too consumed by the overwhelming sense of being watched. The feeling of eyes on her back, cold and unblinking, was suffocating. She couldn't escape it. The apartment was silent again. Too silent. And then a soft noise broke the stillness. A whisper. Not from Ryan. Lily froze. Her pulse raced in her ears, drowning out everything else. The whisper came again, softer this time, almost imperceptible. She spun toward the sound. But there was nothing there. The table before them had been removed, but that didn't mean anything either. "Ryan." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Did you hear that?" He turned toward her, his brow furrowing. "Hear what?" Lily didn't answer. She was already moving, her legs carrying her toward the source of the noise, her eyes scanning the room. The living room was empty, just the shadows dancing across the walls. But there it was again, a soft, almost inaudible whisper. It came from behind her. She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. There, standing just behind the door, was a figure. Tall, thin, its face hidden in the shadows, just out of reach of the dim light. The same figure. Her breath caught in her throat. The eyes. They glowed in the darkness. Faint at first, but then they grew brighter, more defined, until they were unmistakable. It was watching her. Lily's legs trembled and she took a step back, her mouth going dry. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get out of there, but her body refused to move. Ryan turned to her, confused. "Lily, what are you—" But before he could finish his sentence, the figure stepped forward. Lily's body reacted before her mind could process what was happening. She screamed, a primal sound that echoed through the apartment. The figure took another step, and in that instant, the eyes, those glowing eyes, seemed to pierce through her very soul. "Lily!" Ryan shouted, grabbing her by the arm, pulling her away from the doorway. But it was too late. The figure was gone. No trace, no sound, just the heavy silence of the apartment. Lily stood frozen, staring at the spot where the figure had been, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her pulse hammered in her ears, her skin felt clammy, her heart racing faster than it should have. Ryan's grip on her arm tightened. "Lily, you need to calm down. There's nothing here. I don't know what's going on, but this isn't real." "Sleep." "No!" Lily cried, shaking her head furiously. "I saw it. It was there. The eyes. Ryan, the eyes were watching me." Ryan's face softened, but there was a look of concern that quickly morphed into frustration. "You need help, Lily. This isn't healthy. You're seeing things. You're imagining things. This is just stress. It's messing with your head." But Lily didn't believe him. He couldn't. The eyes. They were real. The figure, it was real. She could feel it. She could feel its presence, the weight of it hanging over her, pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. Her eyes flicked to the window again, the reflection catching her attention. For a moment, she thought she saw something moving outside, but when she turned to look, the street was empty. She exhaled sharply, a mix of fear and frustration twisting inside her. But then she saw it, his shadow. It was standing just outside the window, tall and thin, its face obscured in darkness, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, locked onto hers through the glass. Lily's heart stopped. The figure was outside. It had been watching her, and it was waiting. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's outside. It's watching me." Ryan turned toward the window, his eyes scanning the dark street. But when he looked back at her, his expression was one of disbelief. "There's nothing there, Lily," he said, his voice low and steady. "There's nothing. You're seeing things. You're letting this get to you." Lily shook her head violently, her fingers clutching at the fabric of her shirt. She could feel it. The eyes were still on her, still watching, still waiting. But this time, something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to let it win. "I'm not crazy," she whispered fiercely, more to herself than to Ryan. "I'm not." The apartment seemed to hold its breath, the silence stretching out before her like an endless void. The figure outside didn't move. He was still waiting. And this time, Lily wasn't going to run. Lily's fingers trembled as they pressed against the cold glass of the window, her eyes locked onto the figure outside. The faint glow of its eyes pierced the darkness, unwavering, unblinking. It was there. She could feel its gaze seeping into her very soul. It wasn't just watching her anymore. It was waiting. Ryan's voice broke through the tension, soft and insistent. "Lily, we need to leave. Now." But she couldn't move. Her body was frozen, caught between the terror that gripped her heart and the desperate need to confront whatever this was. She turned to Ryan, her face pale, her breath shallow. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It's real. It's been here. It's been watching me for days." Ryan stepped toward her, his expression softening. He reached out to take her hand, but Lily pulled away. "No, don't touch me," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not safe. We have to get out. We have to leave. We can't stay here." But Ryan, despite the fear in his eyes, remained calm. "We're not leaving. You're just scared. We'll fix this. I'll call someone." "No," Lily snapped, her voice sharp and urgent. "There's no one to call. No one can help us now. It's too late." "You don't see it, Ryan, but I do. I can feel it." Ryan hesitated, the uncertainty in his eyes flashing for just a moment. He looked back at the window, then at her, as if he were weighing the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't imagining things. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating, as though the very walls were closing in around them. The whispers, once soft, now began to grow louder. A low, eerie murmur, distant but unmistakable. Lily's heart raced, the sound of it pounding in her ears. "Lily," Ryan began, his voice strained, but before he could say anything else, the room went completely still. The whispers stopped. Ryan gazed directly into the eyes of the older woman. The air grew unnaturally cold. Lily's breath came in quick gasps as she turned back to the window, her eyes wide with terror. The figure was closer now, its form more distinct, its outline darker against the dim light. It was no longer outside. It was inside. Ryan's eyes widened as he followed her gaze. "What the hell?" The figure stood just beyond the doorframe, its face still hidden in the shadows, but its eyes, those eyes were impossible to ignore. They were glowing, like twin orbs of light, burning with an unnatural intensity. The more Lily stared at them, the more they seemed to draw her in, pulling her towards them, deeper and deeper into their hypnotic gaze. "Run!" Lily screamed, but the words came out strangled, hoarse, as if the very air was being stolen from her lungs. She grabbed Ryan's arm, pulling him toward the door, but it was too late. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Ryan staggered back, his face pale with terror. "No! No! This isn't happening!" Lily's eyes were fixed on the figure. It wasn't moving, but it didn't need to. It was everywhere. It was in the walls, in the air, in the very shadows that seemed to stretch out, creeping closer to them with each passing second. The figure's eyes were locked onto Lily now, and she felt an overwhelming pressure, like a hand pressing down on her chest, squeezing the breath from her body. She gasped for air, but it was as if the atmosphere itself had turned to lead. "Ryan," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's here. It's real." Ryan's hands were shaking as he reached for his phone, his fingers fumbling as he tried to unlock it. "I'll call the police," he muttered, his voice tight with fear. "I'll call anyone. We need help. We need—" But as soon as he pressed the screen, the phone went black. "No," Ryan whispered in disbelief, pressing the power button again and again, but it remained dead, lifeless in his hands. Lily's mind was racing. There had to be a way out. There had to be something, but every exit, every escape route seemed blocked. The figure in the corner of the room remained still, watching them both, waiting. And then something shifted. The sound and movement. The figure's head tilted slightly, just enough to make Lily's blood run cold. She could hear the faintest whisper again, but this time it was clear. "Come closer." The words were not spoken, they were felt, vibrating through her very bones. The voice not from the figure, but from within her own mind. It was calling her. It was coaxing her to come closer, to step into its waiting embrace. Lily's feet moved of their own accord, her body trembling as if it were no longer her own. She didn't want to go, she didn't want to obey, but her legs carried her forward, step by agonizing step, until she was standing directly in front of the figure. The eyes burned brighter, now blinding, their glow so intense that it seemed to consume the entire room. Lily felt herself falling into them, her mind clouding over as the darkness swallowed her whole. And then everything stopped, and the figure was gone. The room was empty. Lily stood alone, trembling, her breath ragged, her pulse hammering in her chest. Ryan was beside her, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. He looked at her as if she were a stranger. What happened?" he asked, his voice trembling. Lily shook her head, her hands shaking violently. It was here. I saw it. The eyes, the figure, it was real." Ryan didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at her, his face pale and unreadable. Lily didn't know how much time passed before the feeling of being watched finally started to fade. But even as the silence settled around them, a gnawing feeling lingered in her chest. The figure was gone, but its presence was still there, lurking just beyond the edge of her mind. And she knew one thing for certain. The eyes would never leave her. Not really. She was always being watched. And somewhere, in the dark, the figure was waiting for her to come back. She did. End of story.